All right, our panelists this evening will give a brief overview of the historical connections between Hawaii and Micronesia, sharing of Micronesian experiences, and we'll hear from some of our local Micronesian pastors. So please join me in welcoming our panelists this evening.
Aloha, everyone. This is Kahu Rennie and Kahu Ron Fujiyoshi. And I'm representing Hawaii PAAM, and Ron is with Hawaii Conference Micronesian Committee. And today we are doing a brief webinar to introduce you to the Micronesian ministries here in the Hawaii Conference, a little bit of its history. And then we're going to be hearing from some of our Micronesian brothers and sisters themselves.
We did a workshop at the last Aha Pae āina and had a great turnout, and that was very encouraging to our committee members. So we're glad to be asked again to do another workshop this year.
You know, we have our Micronesian brothers and sisters here in our midst, and we have a long history with Micronesia. And so I'm going to try and share a little bit about what I know from my research and from my relations with some of our dear brothers and sisters. So in case you're not really sure where Micronesia is, here's a little map of the Pacific, and here's Hawaii on the top here, and then Micronesia is to the left. And it's close to the equator, but it's really spread out over thousands of miles, believe it or not. And a lot of times people don't realize that our Micronesian brothers and sisters, they also speak different languages and dialects, so they don't all speak the same language. And here's a closer picture of Micronesia itself, and you can see where the Marshall Islands are: Kiribati, Kosrae, Pohnpei, the Federated States, Guam, North Marianas, Chuuk, Yap, and Palau.
For those of you who are history buffs, you know that Reverend John David Paris was the founding missionary who started Ka'uaha'ao Church in Waiohinu in Ka'u on the Big Island. Actually, he was the one who came up with the idea of sending missionaries from Hawaii to Micronesia. So in 1849, so that's 29 years after the first missionaries came, his wife died, and he was on board the ship Montreal, sailing back to eastern United States with his two daughters in November of 1849. At the Cape Horn, the boat was caught in the doldrums, which means that there's no wind for a number of weeks, so they were stranded for 2 weeks. So while waiting for the wind to pick up, John D. Paris and fellow missionary Reverend C.B. Andrews, who was serving on Molokai, heard the first mate, who had been on whaling ships to Micronesia, say that the chiefs and people were desirous of missionaries to come and teach them. Thinking that the mark of a mature church was to send out missionaries, John D. Paris included native Hawaiians among the missionaries in his proposal, and he wrote it up, took it back to the Prudential Committee of the ABCFM. The proposal was accepted. John D. Paris remarried and returned to Hawaii and became the builder of large numbers, I think 11 churches in Ka'u and the Kona area. Thus, in 1852, the first 5 missionary couples sailed to serve in Micronesia.
When we think about our missionaries or native Hawaiian missionaries, it's been said in terms of our research and things, is that after almost 1,800 years of Christianity, that the Polynesians were the first indigenous missionaries to go. And one of the stories that we may not know is that Pacific kind of was divided up in sections. You know, one part was kind of controlled by the U.S., another part by England, France, Dutch, German, and everybody was trying to run around grabbing up the Pacific. In the South Pacific, the LMS, or the London Missionary Society, went to Tahiti, French. Well, they call it French Polynesian now, but it was Tahiti at that time, and they were there actually in the 1700s. By 1820 already, they were sending out Tahitian missionaries, native Tahitian missionaries throughout the Pacific, including Cook Islands and then Samoa and Tonga. So when you talk to sometimes our brothers and sisters in the South Pacific, they always talk about the London Missionary Society missionaries, which was the indigenous people from Tahiti, which then went to Samoa. Then the Samoans sent out missionaries. And it's always a debate between Tonga and Samoa, who was the first indigenous missionaries who went out. And then from there, they went to Melanesia. The Tahitians, or the ministry in the South, LMS, went to Melanesia. And then in the North, with Hawaii, with the American board, we went to Micronesia. And it's funny, that's where it's kind of funny when you hear about American Samoa, we have a connection there. But other than that, it was Micronesia and the Philippines that we concentrated in. So sometimes when you hear the history about missionaries from Hawaii, you only hear one about just Micronesia. And I have two books here. One is called Island Ministers. It's written by a professor in New Zealand. And he wrote about all the indigenous ministers that went out in the Pacific. Very interesting. And there's a whole section here, even in Hawaii. Another book here is called On the Missionary Trail, which is talks about all the LMS missionaries that went out. And so very parallel histories with Hawaii. And it's very interesting. So you can see why I think that it may sound like it was original, but it really wasn't, because the London Missionary Society was already sending out indigenous missionaries 30 years before us. I think that one of these days we'll hear all the stories of our Hawaiian missionaries, native Hawaiian missionaries that went out. A lot of times when you read books, they may reference them, but they don't really tell their stories. And I'm hoping that someone in AHEC will help write that, you go back and do the research on that. You talk about where our missionaries went, and you can see how we even went to the Marquesas Islands in Tahiti, because it was interesting, because Tahiti first was the British were there first, but then during the war years, the French chased them out, and that's when it became French Polynesia. One of the things we're going to do, hopefully next year or the year after, is we are going to take a delegation from Hawaii to Tahiti, to where our native Hawaiians first went there. Ron, you want to share a little bit about this chart of missionaries?
Well, the darkened ones are the native Hawaiian missionaries. Those that are not darkened are the Caucasian ones that went from ABCFM. And so of the ABCFM missionaries, only you see under Pohnpei, there was a Luther, Halsey, and Louisa Gulick. Luther was a son of a missionary here in Hawaii, so he spoke Hawaiian. But all of the other Caucasian missionaries did not speak Hawaiian, so they only spoke English. And of course, the language in Hawaii was Hawaiian, so all the Hawaiian missionaries spoke Hawaiian. So it caused some difficulty even in communication between members of the same team. So the first missionary, Hawaiian missionary that went to Kosrae were Daniel and Dorika Opunui. Daniel Opunui married Dorika Kaho'olua. He was a graduate of Lahaina Luna, and they were the first native Hawaiian missionaries to set foot in the Kosrae in 1852, on August the 21st, 1852. The Opunuis and Benjamin Galen and Lydia Voss Buck Snow, Benjamin and Lydia Snow, and the Opunuis stayed on Kosrae, and then the boat sailed on to Pohnpei, and the two native Hawaiian missionaries the one couple, Barita and Deborah Kaikaula, were placed on Pohnpei at Ronkichi together with the Sturgises, Albert and Susan Sturgis. Luther and Louisa Gulick were placed at Chalong Point. So they were the first missionaries. So the first missionaries to Pohnpei landed on September 10th in 1852. So that was the very first group of missionaries that went from Hawaii to Micronesia. Now, it's interesting that they didn't go, when Rennie showed you the map, the Marshall Islands is actually closer to Hawaii than Kosrae and Pohnpei. But the reason they didn't go to the Marshalls is because the Marshall Islands had a reputation of killers of whalers. And so they were afraid to go there first. The whalers would come and take the Marshallese women. And so the king, Kaibuke, had went and told all of his people, if the whalers come, you kill them. So that was the reputation. And that's why they first went to Kosrae and Ronkichi first. I think the first missionaries finally went to Marshall Islands in 1857. So first to Kosrae and Pohnpei in 1852, and then finally in the Marshall Islands in 1857. They also went to the Kiribati, or what was known then as the Gilbert Islands, in 1857. But since Kiribati is a separate country and not part of the Federated States of Micronesia, we haven't maintained that close ties with Kiribati that we have with the Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, which has the 4 states of Kosrae, Pohnpei, Chuuk, and Yap. So those are picture of the first ship that went and took missionaries out. So they stopped in Bukataritari of the Kiribati, and then went on to Kosrae and dropped off the Opunuis and the Snows, and then went on to Pohnpei and dropped off the Kaikaulas, the Gulicks, and the Sturgises. Altogether, 79 native Hawaiian missionaries went abroad from Hawaii to what is now known as Kiribati, Federated States of Micronesia, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and also down to the Marquesas down in what is now known as Tahiti. So that's a large number of our leaders that went out beginning in 1852 and up to 1904.
And also, even the London Missionary Society sent up some of the Native Hawaiian missionaries. What we don't hear sometimes is about the Native Hawaiians who went to what they call Rarotonga. There's a Cook Island seminary that goes all the way back to the 1820s. And when I was in Cook Islands, I was pointed out the cemetery with all the Hawaiians are. They went to seminary there. So I'm trying to even compile that list of who went from Hawaii there, because we hear about Lahaina Seminary, but we don't hear that much about the seminary in the Cook Islands. And also, in the history of the Pacific, the colonization, there's a lot of history of the colonization of Micronesia with Germany, Japan later, then of course the U.S. later. So they have been under different colonizers for many years, and it really does affect their generations of what it's like to be colonized under a different country and a different system of government, and even how they did things. So that even affects the way. That's why many of the Micronesians have Japanese blood today. And some of their names are reflected with. I always ask Kachusy, how did you get the name Sushi? Kachusy, and as part of the Japanese history of him. But we have a lot of Micronesians with Japanese names in their name.
Those were the Hawaiian missionaries that went to the Marshall Islands, and where they went. They first went at the bottom to Ebon.
And also many of our Native Hawaiian missionaries, when they came back home, they came and served as pastors here in Hawaii. Even the pastor for Eva Church came back.
Right. Well, maybe even some of the women on the Women's Board of Missions for Pacific Islands don't know that their history was tied in with the missionaries that went to Pohnpei. We're getting to some of the history of the start of the Micronesian Committee that we are representing today. But it started with Chet Terpstra. Chet and Marge Terpstra were among the second wave of missionaries that went to Micronesia. So Chet and Marge came back in 1960, served a number of churches, and then was elected to become the conference minister and general secretary of the Hawaii Conference, United Church of Christ, from beginning in 1968. So he served for 10 years. When he became the conference minister, at the Aha Pae āina in 1968, Chet made the motion, and he said, "Mr. Vice Chairman, I would move that this Aha Pae āina go on record as delegating the board of directors the responsibility of studying the possibility of a more vital relationship with the Micronesian mission." So this motion was passed and was the origin of the Micronesian Committee of the Hawaii Conference that we are part of today. Now, the next slide will show that after 100 years of Native Hawaiians going to Micronesia beginning in 1852, another couple of Native Hawaiians, Takwa and Alice Lee, went and served in Micronesia for 9 years, beginning in 1959. And I think the next slide shows where they went. They first went to Pohnpei and taught at the Owa Christian Training School from 59 to 60. Then they went to Chuuk when there was an appeal for missionaries to go to Chuuk. They volunteered to move to Chuuk and were there at the Kuchua Christian Training School on Tonoas Island from 62 to 65. And finally, when there was an appeal for missionaries to go to the Marshall Islands, they again volunteered and went to the Marshall Islands Christian High School on Rongrong in 1965 to 67. And then Takwali came back and served as the chair of the Micronesian Committee. And in fact, it was this same Micronesian Committee that Takwali was chairing that made the proposal to communicate with the National Church, the Board of World Ministries, and work together with the World Board and the churches in Micronesia, in the Marshall Islands, Kosrae, Pohnpei, and Chuuk, to form what is now known as the Micronesian Council of the United Church of Christ. So all the time we thought it came from the World Board, but no, it came from the Micronesian Committee in Hawaii in 1972, making the proposal that that they would participate more directly in the mission in Micronesia.
I also want to make a comment about the funding that went to help with a lot of the Native Hawaiian missionaries and the Coan Trust, for instance, that was built up over the years. And of course, once World War I came out and World War II, we couldn't send missionaries. We couldn't send people there during the war years. And it was only after the war years, after the Korean War, I think it was, that we began to send some folks from Hawaii down there. But, it seems like, nobody touched that fund for a long time, but it was mainly because of the wars that were going on. And so my prayer is that we begin to look again about how we look at ministry in the whole Pacific.
Other ties between Micronesia and Hawaii is on the right, you see the picture of Eleanor, we call her Mother Wilson, who served for a long time in the Marshall Islands and is best known as the skipper of the Morning Star boat that took supplies and missionaries throughout the Micronesia. And here she is when she returned to Hawaii and was participating in one of the Aha Pae āinas on Kauai, together with Alice Lee there. And so when Mother Wilson retired as a missionary, she came and served in Hawaii, became the pastor of the Ko'olauhuia Church on Anahola, and actually built the church that's standing right now. Nowadays people talking about, asking the big funders for money. Well, she wrote the letter to Elvis Presley asking for a donation, and lo and behold, he sent a donation. So that helped to her build a new Ko'olauhuia church in Anahola. So that's another connection. So she invited two of the promising young people to live in the parsonage with her. And one was Mr. Enja Enos. I think you have another picture of him. He attended Kapa'a High School, even played on their football team, graduated in 1965, and he returned to teach at the Wrong Mission School at the same time that Takwa and Alice Lee moved from Chuuk to the Marshalls. So they were close friends. They're teaching together at the Wrong Mission School. Enja later, this is actually a picture of his memorial service here in Hilo, but Enja was the secretary of the Micronesian Council of the United Church of Christ, and he also became the president of the JRD, the Marshallese United Church of Christ. He passed away on March the 10th, 2019, while staying with his daughter in Hilo. Now, this is a historic meeting when the Micronesian Council of the United Church of Christ sent a delegation to meet with our Micronesian committee in March of 2019. And you can see Reverend Mitian Neth, the president, addressing the group in one of the rooms in Church of the Holy Cross. Well, this is a list that we have. It's not complete, but our count shows that there are 44 Micronesian churches here in Hawaii that are related to the Micronesian Council of the United Church of Christ. So it means that these have roots to the original missionaries that went from Hawaii in 1852 to Micronesia and then on others. So we have the Marshallese churches on the top, and there are 8 here in Hawaii. The Kosrae churches at B, there are 5 here in Hawaii. The Pohnpei churches, and there are 6 in Hawaii. And then the next slide will show the Chuuk churches, and then there are 25 that we know of here in Hawaii. Now, there are still others related to our congregational roots that are not part of the HCUCC, and we're guessing that there are about 25 more of them, mainly Chuuk that are here in Hawaii. So altogether, there are probably 69 churches or so that are from congregational roots here in Hawaii today. So they are filled with young children. The reinstatement of our Micronesian committee, the present form, came because there was this is a resolution that the Hawaii PAAM wrote on reinstating the Micronesian Committee of the Hawaii Conference United Church of Christ. It says, whereas at the last Aha Pae āina, a resolution was passed to extend hospitality to the immigrants. This was 2 Aha Pae āinas ago at the Kamehameha School campus on Maui. Whereas Micronesians, as the newest immigrant group in Hawaii, face problems of discrimination in housing, jobs, education, and medical benefits. And whereas, due to climate change, conditions of past atomic and nuclear tests, lack of medical, educational, and job opportunities, more Micronesians are immigrating to Hawaii and other places in large numbers. And whereas many Micronesians are Christians due to the 60 native Hawaiian missionaries who were sent to Micronesia between 1852 and 1904. And whereas the Hawaii Conference United Church of Christ had a Micronesian committee consisting of Micronesian and non-Micronesian Christians interested in Micronesia, and whereas the Hawaii Conference United Church of Christ is part of the Micronesian Council of the United Church of Christ, together with the global ministries of the United Church of Christ and the church bodies in the Marshall Islands, Kosrae, Pohnpei, and Chuuk, be it resolved that the Hawaii Conference United Church of Christ reinstate the Micronesian Committee to be composed of both Micronesian Christian leaders and non-Micronesian Christians with a commitment to serve Micronesians. So instead of this being sent on to the next Aha Pae āina, because Hawaii PAAM could not submit a resolution, we took it to the Big Island Mokopuni, and its officers passed it, took it to the Hawaii Conference Council, where instead of taking it to the next Aha Pae āina, they assigned it to the Justice and Witness Ministries missional team to reinstate the committee. So under the direction of the chair, Keoki Kiwaha, we approached the Justice and Witness team to have us help reinstate the Micronesian Committee. He gave his approval and suggested that Eric Anderson and Brian Welsh be part of the committee. So with Eric and Brian, we had 4 Micronesians invited to save money. We had them basically from Hilo area, except for Kachusy from Oahu. And so they will tell you more about the distinctions between these 4 major groups of Christians from Micronesia in the order of how the missionaries first went. So Reverend Nixon Jack will talk about Kosrae, then Reverend Bensis Henry will talk about Pohnpei, and then Mr. Stanner Lorenjj will talk about Marshalls, and then finally Kachusy Silander will talk about Chuuk. And so their interviews will come up next.
So that's just a tidbit. Look forward to more information on the Micronesian history on the Hawaii PAAM website, as well as there are on Facebook. We have the Hawaii PAAM Facebook group, and also there is a Facebook group for the Micronesian Churches in Hawaii. So thank you very much, and this ends our segment of the workshop.
Okay, the missionary came to Kosrae in 1852 on a boat named Caroline, and the Snow family and Mr. and Mrs. Snow came with 10 people, and with those Americans from the Board of Mission from Massachusetts, have also Hawaiian Opoinui and the wife Toreka, which they stay in Kosrae, and Kawa folks move on to Pohnpei, and then later on some other mission went to the Marshall Island. As they arrived there, they couldn't come ashore because it was Sunday. The Christianity bring to the islanders' togetherness. They're not individualize themselves, but then they bring as for especially catering. Food is mostly one that brought people, and also the celebrating of Easter to Christmas. They do a lot singing, and the singing are mostly harmonizing. People start moving out with a new compact of free association abroad. Because of the new agreement, we freely come here without no visa. So that brings in a lot of people, especially students, to ILO to study. And the students decided to stay, and then they brought their parents. To me, they brought the parents for medical attention and helped them out with growing up a new family. Being that they're growing up with a new family, then we bring our tradition back home to as like church. And then from there we get family catering, then later on we come as a community. And then a few of the Protestant church accepting some of us to use their facility. And now that the children are born here, we're come across something like, how do I put it? That we have to teach more of the gospel, because the lifestyles of our back home upbringing and over here are a bit different. We are of different custom, culture, tradition. At one time we were by kings and noble. But then now we are with different languages under one God. And I think in God's people, we all see that goodness in all of us, American, Hawaiian, and us Kosraean or Micronesian.
Christianity in Pohnpei, what I know, started with some Catholic priests. They're the first to went to Pohnpei. Somehow things didn't really work out well. And then the Protestants, they went. And what I know, the trip was from Hawaii to Pohnpei, and then went to Lorenjj. That's where they started the mission. Holidays like Christmas, yes, that's the day that we come together, especially in the church. It's more like a big event that we must attend. And also during an Easter week for us Protestant churches here, that's another thing that is very important to us. And another thing is going to church every Sunday is also important. Yeah, education is better than Pohnpei. Another thing is the health, the public health here in Hawaii. Right now, I would think 50% of the Pohnpeian population here are students. I don't think UH. Well, the challenges that we have as far as living here in Hawaii, like finding jobs here, it's like finding a better job. See, although we graduated from University of Hawaii, but it looks like that we cannot get a good job, a good paid job. Yeah, So it's really hard to have your family over here, a family of 5, and it's only one person is working and not getting a better pay job. We don't have a permanent place for worship. We've been using this Holy Cross Church for 12 years, and we don't have any plan yet to look for a place or maybe build a church. Yeah, so it's kind of limiting our vision. We don't really have access. Back home, they have, before they become a pastor, they have training. But here, us pastors and or associate pastors, we're learning our own, we're training ourselves. Yes. Another problem that we have to keep the youth together, because we have a limited time here at the Holy Cross. I would say we really don't have time to gather the youth together. Yeah, we are the fruits of I would say the churches here in the United States. We learn from United States, or we learn from Hawaii. Yeah.
Morning Star. So that's where I went to start heard and learn about missionaries start coming to our islands from that ship called Morning Star. And in fact, I heard that first was some people from Hawaii and mainland brought in the gospel to Ebon, and after that, the Christianity started growing in our islands. The way we worship is mixed, because we have our own ways of, I'll say, celebrating. Like Christmas is one of the big event in our churches, because it's bringing a lot of marshals from other places, like from mainland or from other communities. Like here in Hilo, we can have people from Kona, from Waimea. Some of the reasons that I think brought us here to Hawaii is first the nuclear that they tested in our islands brought concern about health. So I think health is one of the first reason why we are here, for medical purpose, education, and better opportunities. Like our highlands, we don't have enough jobs and opportunities, so I think that's some of the reasons that brought us over here. I came here, attend UH Chilo, and then brought in my family. Before, back in the days, we were so different in our own culture. We worship another things instead of God after. So some of our custom, we would mix it with Christianity and change it to worship God. Like we gather, we have our own dances, singing, and gathering is the most like bringing all people from all communities to gather together to worship and celebrate. One of the struggles that we are facing in our churches are language barriers, because sometimes it's hard for like our pastor. Our pastor are straight from the islands, and the English language is not that much to communicate between them and the Hawaiian churches or whoever we need help from. everybody should know that Marshallese are not different from everybody else. We are worshiping to one God. That, in fact, some of the first missionaries that came to our islands and bringing the gospel is from Hawaii. One name I remember, Izekea. And it is important that the Hawaiian especially knows that we are your brothers and sisters, that you brought in the gospel. And our ties are like from way back. So we are same. We are brother and sister in Christ.
Hello, this is Kachusy Silander. I'm a member of the Chuuk community in Hawaii, though I am a member of the Micronesian Church. Here, as we assimilate into the host culture, it's not a smooth thing, but it's a learning process as well. The churches consist of two groups in Hawaii, and most of them are in Honolulu. So we have the Chuuk Congregational Churches and the Chuuk Evangelical Churches Association as well, and other denominations. As we are here in Hawaii due to the treaty, so we have learned so many things, and we are here to stay. And we are trying to reach out to our fellow Christian brothers and sisters, and we are the growth of the ministry, the missionary of Hawaii. They came to evangelize Chuuk, as well as the rest of Micronesia. We are navigating ourselves through the so many barriers, not only of any problem that arises with respect to the law, but we also have seen the differences in theological point of view. Ours is more conservative, and the Hawaii Conference or the United Church of Christ is quite liberal for us, some of the practices and belief. But anyway, this is one thing that is that makes the United Church of Christ unique, because it accepts all different kinds of belief and theological point of view. We are here to fellowship and to learn so many things in the new society, as well as our the church that once came to evangelize us. Now we are here, the fruit of their ministry. This is our wish, that we're going to live in harmony, not only with churches in Hawaii, but the whole society, that we can be productive and learn so many things. And we also hope that you should also learn what we have brought into this new culture. We are here as just like anybody who have come. And we are the latecomers. We are hoping that, we can also be part of the Hawaii Conference in some respect, or even fully members of the Hawaii Conference. And it is our wish that we should be joined together as fellowship, as fellow brothers and sisters in Christ. That is the common denominator that has brought us all together, and this is our common understanding. Aloha, thank you.
We are very fortunate to have our conference minister on our committee, and he was invited to join the HCUCC officers meeting in Pohnpei. So he's going to share a few words about his experience there. David?
Thank you, Ron. Last fall, I attended the Micronesian Council United Church of Christ meeting in Pohnpei. Ostensibly, it was a meeting meant to plan for a larger meeting of the full group of HCUCC entities for this summer, but like a lot of other large plans, COVID wrecked it for us, so we did not get to that second meeting. The Micronesian Council is made up of 5 judicatory entities: the United Church of Christ in the Marshall Islands, the United Church of Christ on Kosrae, the United Church of Christ on Pohnpei, the United Church of Christ congregations in Chuuk, plus the national offices represented through the global ministries that we share with the Disciples of Christ, and then of course the Hawaii Conference make up those 5 entities. While there, we engaged in conversations largely about care of Micronesian churches here in Hawaii. And we worked toward an agreement, I should say, in which the basis of that agreement is to share culture so that as a church relates to its mother church back on the islands, that is the culture, and with that, the polity and governance system that is primary and guides the relationship. And as churches or ministers from churches seek to relate to the Hawaiian conference, then the polity, the governance of the United Church of Christ becomes the guiding piece for us. So we're still, as in any relationship, evolving and living into that. We saw probably the best results of that relationship this summer as we were facing similar issues around COVID-19 and trying to get things particularly communicated to our Micronesian churches, and the Micronesian Council UCC became an important part of that communicating process. So that's where we're at with that meeting. I'm still looking forward to this larger meeting that has been delayed, but we're hoping by next summer we'll be able to meet in that setting.
Thank you, Conference Minister. I think we were able to incorporate a short video by Kahu Brian Welsh of Haili Church to share his experience of donating another bell to Pohnpei.
Aloha and welcome to Haili Congregational Church. We're sitting here in the sanctuary of this historic building, and it reminds me of so much of the history that has gone on here. I'm part of the Micronesian Committee because of this history. Back in the 1800s, it was Titus Cohen, the famous revivalist, who helped train Hawaiians to become missionaries that were sent ultimately to Micronesia and beyond. We also know that he motivated the children in the Sunday schools to give offerings to help build, fund, and support the Morning Star ship, which took original missionaries there to Micronesia. Later in our history, we had a young man named Reverend Takwali, who was trained as a missionary and went to Micronesia. While in Pohnpei, his life was saved by a young man named Henry Wilson, who helped him when he was on fire to get out of a ship and put the fire out in the water. Well, Henry Wilson was so inspired by Takwali that he went into the ministry also. And eventually, in a big full circle, he came to Hilo later in life, where his granddaughters were being trained at the university. He attended Haili Church, and he also came to me in 2018 and asked me for a bell. I was a little bit surprised, but he told me Haili Church has a history of giving bells to Micronesia. And he showed me some paperwork that said in 1961, Haili Church gave a bell which was put in the mother church at Colonia in Pohnpei. Well, he did not know that a deaconess here at Haili Church named Auntie Haveawaiau had brought a bell years earlier and had said that it came from Kapiolani Chapel, which was no longer used. and that when God wanted to send it out for use, he would send someone to ask for it. So I was very blessed to be a part of this God story, where we eventually blessed the bell at our Hawike 2019, sent it to Pohnpei, and then myself, Kahu Mike Warren, and Pastor Ron Fujiyoshi attended the annual summer Rongamau Festival, the 167th anniversary of the coming of the gospel, where I personally had a chance to dedicate that bell in its new home of the Kependao Dolor Church in Pohnpei. My encouragement for you is to get involved, to be blessed by this wonderful connection, and realize we are brothers and sisters connected so tightly together, and that it is important for us to continue these historical connections. So I want to encourage you, learn what you can, share what you can, have an open heart. And if you want to know more about this event or see more pictures, on the Hawaii Conference UCC Facebook or website, there is an album from 2019 with those things in it. God bless each and every one of you. Aloha.
Our host pastor for all of our meetings has been Eric Anderson, and not only has he hosted our committee, but he's also hosted other Micronesian congregations at Church of the Holy Cross. So he's going to share a little bit to let people know who are thinking of hosting Micronesian churches, who they can come to.
Definitely, you can come to me. Hosting a congregation means an extension of your church's ministry. These are folks to whom your direct ministry is probably not currently reaching because of language, because of custom, because of relationships. So bringing one of these congregations in to share your space is an immediate expansion of your church's impact upon your community. It's also an amazing opportunity to engage in relationship and to learn more about your faith as you learn about theirs. But here's the thing about any ministry. Ministry remains work. I will not pretend that everything is easy. There's scheduling, there's making sure everything's ready for the next group when one group is done. But truthfully, was any ministry worth doing really easy? I don't think so. But this is very much an exercise of our faithfulness to Christ.
Thank you, Eric. We have most of our members of our committee on here to answer a few questions. We have a little time left. Stanner Lorenjj, who represented the Marshallese, is at work. So taking his place is Carmina Alec. And Carmina actually is Kosraean, but she's married to a Marshallese doctor, Dr. Alec at the Kaiser Permanente. And she's also the president of the Marshallese Club in Hilo and has done a lot of work with the Marshallese with COVID and others. So she's sitting in for Stanner, is a member of the Hilo Marshallese Ministry. Carmina, you want to introduce yourself? I think people should get to know you. You have been a leader in the Marshallese community, and I think people would love to hear more from you.
Thank you, Ron. My name is Carmina Alec, and I'm from the Micronesian Islands, both Kosrae. My father was from Kosrae. His name was William Allen. His actual last name was Magwelang. But the people that he worked with couldn't pronounce that, so he used his father's first name, Allen. But I'm from the Magwelang family in Kosrae, and I'm glad to see our pastor Nixon Jack here as well, and all the other pastors from the other churches. It's refreshing to see familiar faces. As Pastor Silander, I met in court as a colleague of mine interpreting, and Pastor Bensis Henry as a colleague in the community. We were fighting for our insurance back when they were going to cut us all off. Anyway, I'm also from the Marshall Islands, and that's where most of as a Marshallese, you kind of lean more towards your mother's side of the family. You know, growing up, you are brought up as in a matrilineal culture. So I'm more familiar with that, although we're also very proud to be a part of the Kosraean community here. My husband and I moved here to Hilo back in 2015 as Kaiser Permanente needed a physician to fill in for somebody who had just left. So he applied and they immediately grabbed him from Kahuku and placed him here. And I guess he's been doing okay because we're still here. But we're very glad ever since we got here. I was selected to be president of the community, and we're still going at it. We're trying to bring education to our community members and you know, keep them healthy. We have a Facebook group that we educate them on and let them know of COVID and how to take care of themselves. But I also am very involved with our Jaran Radigron here in Hilo, our Hilo Marshallese Ministries Church. And our pastor doesn't really speak English, as most of the deacons don't as well. So I was selected to come and join this meeting and be on the panel. And I am so grateful for, you know, being educated, because I know that I have family way back when that were involved with the first ministers who came to Kosrae. And my husband's family, his grandfather was Bornheini, who was a pastor in Laura. And he was the son of Carl Heine. So both our families are very, I mean, we know as young kids, we grew up knowing that, you know, we have some history, but we didn't really pick up on it. We went to church with our family members, and we, you know, got together on Christmas and all the occasions, but and we sang our Christmas songs and everything. But this is really refreshing to, you know, get a taste of the history, and I appreciate you all very much. And I would like to offer my services on behalf of the Marshallese congregation. I'm hoping that my involvement with the church will be able to bring them to a more stable situation where they can possibly get a church that they can remain in consistently, and we can educate them, we can work with them, and but I know that it's going to take some time, so but I'm here to help out in any way I can.
Carmina, there was one question that said, how has the COVID-19 affected the Micronesian communities? And I think you and your husband are kind of close to that. So maybe you can explain a little bit about what you know.
Yeah, my husband is currently the chair of our Marshallese Big Island Task Force on COVID-19. He's also on the Hawaii State Marshallese COVID Task Force. And we've been working very closely, and whenever and a community has a surge in their COVID cases, as an interpreter, I get very involved with the families We were able to deliver food and PPEs to those isolated families because they lost 2 weeks of work. We were able to educate them on how to protect themselves. And because of the extended family situation, we had to pull some of their people out and put them in isolation elsewhere. As you know, most of our families have extended families. So that's kind of the difficult situation right now. But we had a handful as of 2 weeks ago of isolated families, but now they're all cleared and everybody's fine. We worked with our pastors to educate them on how to manage their funerals and their church services. That's what the task force has been doing. And we're hoping that the other island, Micronesian island groups will reach out to us, as the doctors are rare and hard to find that will come and sit on your task force. But my husband is willing to do that for the other islands if needed.
There's a couple of questions from Dusty Santos. Both of them related to standing for pastors coming out of Micronesia in the United Church of Christ USA and in the Hawaii Conference specifically. And I'm taking that on because one of my other hats is that I'm chair of a committee on ministry. So the first thing is that the United Church of Christ USA simply does not provide authorization for ministries that are not of the United Church of Christ USA. So a United Church of Christ Pohnpei pastor serving a United Church of Christ Pohnpei congregation would not need UCC USA authorization. That person already has the authorization for their ministry. As far as receiving authorization for UCC USA ministries, which I gather is something that that Dusty Santos is engaged in at Central Union Church, one of the sad realities is that at this point there are no denomination to denomination agreements between the UCC USA and any of the Micronesian churches out of our tradition. There is one that exists between the UCC USA and the Congregational Christian Churches of America and Samoa. So there isn't an established way of doing mutual recognition of ministries at the denominational level. What that means is that it becomes a matter for each individual association's committee on ministry and figuring out what process makes the most sense. It may be dual standing, it may be privilege of call. That's one of the things you get to work out with your committee. Most of all, however, one of the other questions there was about classes. There will always be an educational requirement in participating or in getting authorization in the United Church of Christ USA. And that's because we work differently than other churches. If I were going to serve a UCC in Kosrae congregation, I would need education in how that church works because I don't know. And I would fully expect to be required to learn that before engaging in that ministry, or as my ministry begins, but certainly before I'm given full authorization. I hope that's helpful. It also means, however, that association to association will have somewhat different procedures, particularly because we don't have a national, or that is denominational agreement at this time. The other question was about funding, and I'm going to punt that one because I'm not aware of funding, at least through the Micronesian Committee, but there may be other resources in the conference that somebody else knows about. Is there funding out there that may be offered or sponsorship for those who may need credit essentially ways to fund a seminary or extended seminary theological education?
The answer to that is a conditional yes, all depending upon the institution from which you're receiving a class and if we have a relationship to them or not.
Let's see here. There's also a question for Ron and for Rennie. That there was not a mention of Lauren's family, the Buck family, and the Hanlons and their ministry in Micronesia. I will actually immediately apologize to you, Lauren. Pastor Nixon Jack did, in fact, vigorously try to include your family in his presentation, and I relentlessly removed it because it was running long. Sorry.
Any other questions? I know, we've gone over time already, and it was a great job that Eric and others did to try and cut down the interviews to make it fit during the time limit. But we just wanted to share the breadth of people we have on our committee, and then have you see their faces and hear them, so that you begin to distinguish that there are many different kinds of Micronesians here in Hawaii, and they speak different languages, and you need to learn more about them. And maybe this will give you an introduction, and you can follow up asking more questions of them. I think some of the interviews are actually longer, so I think they might be made available on the on our conference website later.
I want to thank the panelists for sharing this evening. It was very informational, learned a lot. So thank you again to our panelists, awesome job, and thank you all for joining us. Have a good evening.